Greetings, students, and welcome to this first edition of Mr. Zollers' Social Studies podcast. Today we will be doing just an introductory podcast, but while I have your attention, let me talk to you a little bit about the podcast that we're going to be using this year. Let me start by answering the question, well, why are we using podcasts? Why bring them into the classroom? Well, there are a couple reasons. First of all, it allows for what I call pre-teaching. Essentially, by presenting you with this information before you come to class, that will allow us to have more time for activities, for simulations, for group work when you actually come to class. Let me give you another reason. It also allows students to work at their own pace. If you can move quickly through the podcast, great. If you need to go back and listen to it a couple of times before you understand it, you have that ability. You have the freedom to use these resources as you see fit. Plus, this is going to make it a lot easier for students when they're absent. You can go back, watch that podcast, and catch up easily. And then the last reason why I think we should use podcasts in class is because it's just another way to present this information, mix things up a little bit, and make social studies class more interesting. Now, let me give you some tips on how to use these podcasts. First of all, when I assign a podcast, always watch the podcast. If I bothered to make a podcast, that means that information is important. Also, if you're watching the podcast and it asks you to write down information like a definition, make sure you do that. If information is in the podcast, it's because that information is important. And then the last thing is, throughout the podcast, I will include little symbols like the ones you see here. Pay attention to those symbols because that will help you direct you to the information that is important. Now, let me show you how to access those podcasts, although if you're watching this, you've probably already figured it out. What I will do is show you my web page here. Now, if you go to my homework page and you click down until you find the podcast under the assignments and resources, if you click on it, it will load the page either in YouTube or in TeacherTube, and then you can watch the podcast from there. Well, that's it for this first edition of Mr. Zollers' Social Studies podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it and continue studying the social studies.